Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone, on today's episode, which is the 50th episode, I can't believe it. It is the 50th episode of the One Inside podcast. I am thrilled and I'm so excited and I just want you to celebrate with me. The 50th episode. It's crazy. So on the 50th episode, I get to chat with Anne Hallward, who is the founder and host of Safe Space Radio. And I'm so excited. And she is so warm. She's someone that I had not met before. A couple people had said, "Oh, you've got to talk to Anne." And so I was a little bit worried because I'm like, I don't know her. And she was so warm and so friendly. And I just really, really liked talking to her. And we had a good time. Even though we talk about serious things, I think that we still had fun. The other thing I wanted to say before I let you guys go listen to the episode is that there is a lot happening in our country right now and a lot of awful stuff. So Duran is the founder of Black Therapist Rock. We are working together to do a 4-part series in July, July is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we're going to be doing 4 episodes in July together. So that's going to be super fun and timely. And so stay tuned for that. So hope everyone's doing okay. I'd love to hear from you at IFS Tammy on Instagram and on the One Inside Facebook page. I really appreciate this community and I really appreciate the internal family systems community. I think right now they're doing a lot. There's a lot of free webinars and there's a lot of good stuff happening that just really help me feel connected to you guys and to our community. So I'd love to hear from you on Instagram or Facebook. Take care. Enjoy this episode with Anne. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say is Safe Space Radio produced a show on talking to white kids about race and racism. I included the link of that on the show notes, but if you also just go to safespaceradio.com, there is the episode there. So check that out for sure. Enjoy this episode. I'll talk to you guys soon. Hi.
Hi.
I was playing outside with my son and we were playing. He took all the recycling and put tape around it and we made swords. Tell everybody where you are and what's around you. Like if you were to look out a window, what would you see?
So I live in Saco on an old farm in rural Maine. And when I look out my window, I see an old barn with a dugout with a mother fox and 6 baby foxes. And they're like puppies. They frolic and chase each other and tumble over each other and chase around the tree and hide and leap out at each other. They're all fluffy and they're beginning to get all orange. We live on this kind of old pond, so I can look through the apple trees that are starting to come out in bud, and I see the water, and there's a pair of ducks that live on the pond. So we watch them, and there's some old painted turtles that come out on the tree logs to sun. So I feel so lucky to live here. But after medical school and residency, and I was teaching in Boston for a while. We wanted to have a family, and my life was so busy. I just couldn't see being a good mother and doing what I was doing at the same time. So we kind of made this radical change and moved to Maine.
Do you still have busy, hurried parts of you?
Oh, oh no, Tammy.
Yeah, no, not at all.
I moved, it was called the geographical cure.
Yeah.
I moved out of Boston and that was just all taken care of and my parts didn't come with me.
Oh, that's good.
Actually, I feel like in some ways COVID-19 has been a profound wake-up call to my rushing around parts, because I feel like I've really slowed down, and it's been so wonderful. I've needed it.
Mm,
My life was a little out of control.
mm,
So this has been a helpful respite to me to walk every day, have time to write in my journal every day, and be a lot more inward.
mm,
And I'm grateful for that, as much as I know that this is a devastation to so many people. In my own life so far, it's helped me make some big changes in my life.
mm. What do you do about the parts of you, if you might not, well, I'm guessing you have them, but I have parts that have just created I have big project, like, it's ridiculous. This week especially, I was like, "Something has to give." Yeah, something's gotta give. I can't keep up the pace.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, my do too much parts are very strategic. And so after their initial setback, because we couldn't go places, yes, now they've come up with new lists,
Yes,
projects.
yes.
No, it's so true. It's so true. I'm working in my own therapy with the parts of me that cope with feeling powerless by
Mm,
wanting to be really effective and get so much
mm,
done. And
yeah,
so if I work with my exiles that can feel powerless and helpless, that can help me a little bit. I don't want to over
mm.
pretend here that I'm like, oh yeah, I'm so over that, because that would just
Yeah,
be completely misleading.
right. What made you interested in people's stories?
Well, there's the conscious reason and there's the unconscious reason, probably. I think consciously, I was always interested in intimacy. I was
Mm,
interested in really connecting and knowing someone deeply and feeling like there was realness there.
mm,
So, as a doctor in medical school, we were being told you'd have 8 minutes with a patient.
mm,
Well, that just seemed so awful. I mean, I just couldn't imagine having a life like that where you
mhm,
didn't really know anybody. And
mm,
so I always wanted realness. I always wanted authenticity and connection.
mm,
And stories seem to be like the fastest route to authenticity and connection.
mm,
Um, Plus, a story is fun. Like my mother jokingly once said to me that one of her primary goals as a parent was to raise children who loved books.
aw,
And she read to us faithfully. And every night I had a bedtime story, and I always loved being told stories.
mm.
So I always wanted to know what was going to happen. I was just curious. And I would
I
live them. I mean, I feel like when I
mm,
listen to a story, sometimes I forget that it's not happening to me. Like I'm very in it. So it feels very enlivening.
mm. I love that idea too, that it is connecting. It increases the intimacy.
Really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about Safe Space Radio and what it is and just anything you want to tell about it.
Okay. So we've been broadcasting for 12 years. And the idea first came to me after I'd had my first level 1 training in IFS, and I was really learning about shame.
Mm,
And what I started noticing was that almost no matter what a person was coming to me for, whether it was depression or trauma or addiction or anxiety, the heart of their suffering was the ways in which they felt weak, defective, unlovable, a failure. And they didn't feel like they could tell anyone that because they felt so ashamed. And so it made them alone with their worst suffering.
mm,
So I was like, I'd see maybe 6 to 8 hours of patients a day. And no matter whether it was what it was that brought them in, I felt like, oh, the heart of their suffering is the same. It's this
mm,
alone, silenced feeling of being unlovable and this sort of like cringing inside. And I felt
mm,
like I'd sort of stumbled across a public health emergency. And I felt like I have to come up with some kind of public health intervention. I don't know what. I have no idea. I really didn't have any training in public health. And then I noticed that all my patients, when they were really talking about the heart of their suffering, they would look away. They would break eye contact. And I thought, oh, so shame is about visual scrutiny, like you don't want to be seen in your worst moment. Like your whole body sort of collapses in on itself. So then I thought, oh my gosh. So I was on a walk with a friend and suddenly the idea came to me, radio. The guest, unlike, sensationalist daytime TV where the guest is seen and has to worry about their outfit and like holding in their stomach or something exhausting like that. Radio, the guest can tell a story and no one has to know what they look like and they don't have to worry about their image. And I thought, oh, and also the listener is in private. Listener is driving or washing dishes or on the treadmill or whatever. And nobody has to know that they're listening to a show on sexual dysfunction or something that they would feel, shy.
Right.
So it's very intimate and private. And so I went on, I read about the mission statements of all the different radio stations in Southern Maine. I found a wonderful station, WMPG in Portland, that was interested in inclusivity of different diverse community voices. I took a class, auditioned the show, and that was 12 years ago.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so now we produce 4 documentaries a year. It used to be a weekly show. And now we produce these hour-long documentaries that have multiple voices per show, all about subjects that are hard to talk about, that make people feel ashamed, that are associated with stigma. And I see the show as a public health intervention, not only to reduce shame, stigma, isolation, and silence, but also to foster courage and empathy. So that's us in a nutshell.
That sounds great. So, and is it's still radio? It's not on, for some reason I was thinking, I don't know. It's still on radio though. Is
It's
it?
radio. Yep, it's on our last series of 4 shows aired on 221 NPR stations in 35 states. So it's primarily public radio, but we podcast. We've been podcasting since 2010. We were one of the first mental health podcasts in the country.
That's awesome.
So we're available on, all the different podcast platforms.
Great.
As I
Okay.
hope you are.
Yes. Yes.
Good.
Yes. And if there's someone out there that's what happened is someone was like, "Hey, you're not on Stitcher," and I was like, "Oh," and so then I did all the different things
Yeah.
you have to do to get on Stitcher. So if I'm not on something, let me know, and I will do the
I'm
things.
happy to review those with you.
Oh yeah,
If
that
I
would be
can help,
great.
I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
That would be great. Yeah. In Safe Space Radio, this is where people will come on and tell their stories of their secret stories, the stories that they're afraid to talk about. And what have you noticed about the importance or the power of people telling these stories?
Almost all of my guests tell me that the reason they come on the show is they want to transform their suffering into a gift for others. So if they have personal knowledge of a struggle with homophobia, suicidality, having done something really bad as a child, sexual assault, whatever it is, they want to tell the story because they know how awful it is to live in that silenced, shamed place. And they feel like if their story can open a door for the listener to feel like, oh, I'm not alone. Someone else gets it. I could tell my story too and feel a sense of belonging again. Then I want to tell my story. So we think of the show as trying to redeem a terrible experience and transform it into a gift.
Well, I listened to your TED Talk. So your TED Talk is on the Safe Space Radio website. And one of the things that you said, and I thought this was so true, is the most personal stories are often the most universal stories. And I loved that because it's there, we often, that's not how we think. Like I've got this personal story and it's mine and I feel a secret and I feel so ashamed of it. But that idea that if I tell this personal story, it's so universal and then it's connecting people and people feel it's funny because I think of it the opposite way. Like when I hear someone tell a story that I really can identify with, I feel so heard and understood and
Hmm.
and I don't feel alone if someone is sharing
Yes.
their story.
I think for that to happen, the person has to be willing to be very vulnerable and real.
Mm,
Because that is, I think, in some ways, the function of vulnerability. Like, why does vulnerability exist? Because that's the place of connection.
mm,
And so when we dare to share it voluntarily, not because it's coerced out of us or exposed out of us, which is a horrible experience, but we dare to come forward with it voluntarily, yeah, we can all relate. Because even though I may not have your particular struggle with alcoholism or assault or whatever it was, everyone knows what it's like to be afraid. Everyone knows what it's like to feel alone and scared to let yourself be really seen,
mm,
and want to be lovable and want to be seen as good. We all know
mm,
that. So
mm.
we can relate.
Yeah, I was thinking that it's actually like this linking thing happens. Like not only if I'm the one telling my story, there's this like release of shame that comes out, but then you're also getting something, and then there's even if I'm not seeing you, I'm not interacting with you, it feels like there's this. I'm doing this thing with my hands, which you guys can't see, but there's sort of this linking that happens.
Yes. Connecting. Yeah.
Yeah,
And we feel
yeah,
stronger for it.
yeah. Which is funny because I think parts of us tell us that it'll make us weak. If people really know about us, they really know our secret, then they won't like us or we'll be weak or they won't think of us as strong, but it's the opposite happens.
Well, we rob shame of its power.
Mm,
This is what I think about. The analogy I use is the closet. If I'm closeted, and I feel like the closet applies to so many hidden things, not just being LGBTQ. Um, when you're in the closet, it's dark and you're alone and you can't get any new perspective on your story and your
mm,
experience.
mm,
And it fosters your shame. But when you dare to come out of the closet to open the door, all
mm,
this light comes in and suddenly you can begin to see the situation in a new way. And you
mm,
can begin to see and feel people's compassion and welcome of you. So there's this way that stepping through that door really robs shame of its power.
mm.
And it is strengthening.
I never thought about that, that the closet is actually dark and then
Yes.
I'm alone in it.
Yes. The closet is no fun.
No.
Yeah. So I
Mm,
I love this quote from Harvey Milk, who you may know as I think one of the first publicly elected LGBTQ guys in San Francisco. And our very first national special was on suicide prevention for LGBTQ teens because they
mm,
were among the highest risk for suicide in the country. And he said, "This is how the revolution happens, one lonely teenager at a time." And it's just like, oh, wow,
I
each
know.
one daring to come out to their family. And each of their courage takes so much courage.
Mm,
So I have come to see coming out of the closet as a revolutionarily courageous act. And
mm.
that really helps lead to social change.
Well, I was thinking of the closet as like the exiles being in the basement, like the protectors being up front, in the front of the house, and the exiles being in the basement, and the protectors working really hard to make sure that we don't feel the exile energy.
Well, I think that, our parts get exiled initially because we get the impression that we won't, they're not wanted, usually by our family. So
Mm,
they're not wanted parts of ourselves. And then over time, right, they carry so much pain that we start keeping them in the closet, not only because we're afraid that we won't get loved if we show them, but also because we're afraid of how much pain they carry.
yeah,
And we don't
yeah,
want to feel that kind of pain.
yeah.
Um, and coming out itself, while I'm describing it as this very courageous move, at times it can be excruciatingly painful. I mean, I think the data is that 40% of all homeless teenagers are LGBTQ. So, I mean, the risk is very real.
Right, right, right.
So yeah, we are afraid that our exiles will ruin everything if they come out.
Mm.
Our protectors are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I wonder too if this is, and we don't know. I think that's the other thing is our protectors don't know what's going to happen, right? They don't know that like we're going to come out of the closet and we're going to be met and there's going to be connection and there's going to be love and there's going to be increased intimacy. They don't know that, and there can't be a promise of that.
No. So part of why I became really interested in how to tell exiled stories is because often telling an exiled story does not go well. And, we feel like, dun, 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 I'm finally ready to tell this, story of trauma or this story that's been silenced for years. And then the telling itself, I call it the repetition of traumatic silence.
Oh, wow.
You were silenced to begin with, and that was awful. For some people, the silence after trauma is worse than the trauma itself. But then, they're finally ready to come forward and tell it, and they get received in dismissive, rejecting, shaming, blaming, victim blaming ways. And so I started really studying, like, how can we help people? What do we need to know to help telling a silent story have the best chance of being heard?
Yeah.
But I often think about, the parable of the prodigal son, and in that story, for those who did not go to a lot of Sunday school as a child, I went to too much Sunday school as a child. In that story, right, this father has two sons. They divide the inheritance, and the younger son goes off and wastes it all, and so-called, on living with prostitutes and who knows what. The implication is he does all these immoral, bad things, and he's working as a pig. He's working with pigs, and decides to come home because he's not getting any food. He's hungrier than the pigs, and to beg his father's forgiveness. So he comes home to his father. And if we think about him as an exile, so if we just think about this in IFS terms, so he's an exile. He's an unwanted bad part, right? He was bad.
Yeah.
He was using drugs. He was doing prostitution. He wasted his money.
Yeah.
So he's the bad exile, and he comes home. And sometimes in that story, right, the father is very forgiving and compassionate and welcomes him and kills the fatted calf. But part of why I love that story is there is the jealous brother who's like, hey, wait, I've been a good boy all this time, and you have never even killed like a little goat for my friends to have a party. Like, hey, what about me?
Yeah.
And I feel like that story represents reality. When someone comes home from exile, they are not usually welcomed by every part, with open arms. And preparing for that in advance can help all of us who have silenced parts, and most of us do, be received well. So I've created this kind of 7-step process that I think increases the chances. It does not come with a guarantee, but it will radically increase the chances of having an exiled story be welcomed back when it is finally told. And I would be happy to share it with you.
I would love to hear about it. There's a
Okay.
part of me that wants you to know that I really identify with that brother. Like the good girl, like, you know what? I wish I would have gone out and partied. And there's a part of me that's like, man, why wasn't I a little bit more naughty? Like,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I
Like
love that
I've
you
been
said
the
that.
good girl, and you know what? I'm sick and tired of being the good girl, actually, and I'm kind of pissed.
I love that brother is included in the story because we can all relate to that. Like, hey,
Yeah,
this is not actually fair.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not fair.
yeah. I
And
just wanted to say that.
thank you. I love that you did. All parts are welcome. Right?
Yeah.
Yes. In praise of the rule following but pissed off jealous brother
Right,
in
right.
all of us. In all of
Yes,
us.
that's
Yes.
right. That's
Thank
right.
you I love that, Tammy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for, there's a part of me that was like, don't say that because it's not really all, it's off topic. Don't
Oh
say
no.
that. Who knows what she's going to think of you. So thank you. I feel
Oh no,
connected
no.
to you. Yes, I would
If it isn't real, it's not, there's no value to it.
yeah, that's how I feel. That's how I
Yeah.
feel. Um, so yes, tell me about this 7-step process. And so this is a process that if I was feeling um, like either something that I did currently, or there's something in my past, or there's something I was struggling with, this would really help me share it with a loved one.
And I would just want to add to that list, or something that happened to you,
Okay.
something that was done to you that made you, but that you blamed yourself for. Because of course, children always blame themselves,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
that's the genesis of shame. So the first thing is you get to tell it in your own way. You don't have to do it in some run right way. So for instance, there's this great series of books. You may know Laurie Halse Anderson's work. Her first book was called Speak, and it was a story about sexual assault. And her second story is called Shout, and the whole book is poetry. And she tells the story of her sexual assault in these shouted poems.
Mm,
I just love that she created the format that worked for her.
yeah.
So there isn't a right way to do it. It can be through a photo essay. It could be through a dance.
Yeah.
Could be through a podcast. There's it's a way to honor yourself, to do it in your way.
Mm,
So that's the first thing, is it gets to be in your way.
mm. And
Um,
I feel like just as you're saying that, I'm like, wow, that feels a little, speaking of like revolutionary for someone who has been through trauma, that how much of their experience hasn't been their way.
exactly. So I feel like the telling needs to undo the process, right? So that this is not one of the 7 things, but this is an aside.
Yeah.
So often in trauma, time feels like sped up and out of control, and there's no choice, there's no room, there's this helplessness, right? So
Yeah.
the first important thing is you choose the time and the way.
Mm,
So you create the safety and the choice. So the process itself is the opposite of the experience.
I love it. That's great.
Yeah. The second thing is, and this is really a way in which IFS I think is profoundly helpful, is you work through the shame with a therapist, or if for any reason therapy isn't accessible to you, it may be in your journal or with a best friend. But you work through the shame first before you share it more publicly.
Mm,
Because what happens is when you tell a story with a lot of shame that still has its teeth in your neck, and still is like really powerful, sometimes the listener will feel like a kind of pressure to take care of you or to make it better that they might
oh,
resent.
okay.
Like they can
Okay.
feel a sort of neediness uh, and kind of victimness that people
Okay.
recoil from sometimes. And
Okay.
so it's really worth doing the work of choosing someone first, choosing like the first person you tell it to, whether it's a therapist or a best friend or a close sibling, who will not shame you and who will help you see that you couldn't help it. It wasn't your fault. You were scared. You didn't know. You were alone. You didn't know what else to do. You froze. Whatever it was,
Mhm.
they can see your humanity and they can see your goodness.
Mm,
So that helps. And in IFS, we have this process we call unburdening, where and burdens are so often mistaken beliefs about shame.
mm,
You know, a belief that I am bad because I did this,
mm,
or because I didn't do this.
yeah. Yeah.
Um, so
So it sounds like in that second part, it's almost in IFS terms, it's like letting those parts feel self and self just being with them and just in unburdening the shame with the connection to self.
yes, absolutely. So I do this exercise before I do radio interviews, and this might be useful to you, and it's related to this, which is I call it seeing the beauty. And we talk about the 8 C's of self, like one of the qualities of self energy is clarity. And so I take a moment before I do an interview where I just pause and I ask for just sort of a moment where I look at my guest until I sort of start to see them sparkle. Like I start to see their radiance and their sweetness, which is what I mean by seeing the beauty. And when I see them that way, then I know that my heart is so soft and open, and then I'm ready. And the same is true for our relationship with ourselves. So sometimes, if I have a part that's ashamed, I might go look in the mirror. And this can be really hard to do because God knows you look in the mirror and you're like, oh, that's too this, that's too big, that's too small, that's too wrinkly, that's too, right? There's a million critical voices. But I really just look in my eyes, and that helps in the mirror. I don't have to look at my body or my nose or my forehead. I just focus on the eyes. Those places that could be improved just a little. And I look into my eyes to see the sort of soulfulness and the beauty, and that helps me let go of shame. It helps me. And so when we see ourselves in that sort of sparkly, soft, warm-hearted way, it changes it. And so that's that. So that's the second thing is to see that young part of you or that old part of you that did or that has the shame, and to see the beauty and radiance of that part, and to often ask for help in doing so. I have found that IFS therapy has just been profoundly helpful. I've struggled with a lot of shame. I don't want to pretend otherwise. We always teach what we most need to learn. So yeah, still working on my shame. So the third step is to get really honest with yourself for what I call the hidden agenda. Like, are you telling the story because you really want to prove something? Are you trying to prove your innocence? Are you trying to get some more money? Are you trying to get some more benefit because you're entitled to it because you were so deprived? Like, just get really clear with yourself about some kind of hidden second agenda.
Yeah.
Because that will sabotage it. People will smell that a mile off and be like,
because they'll feel it. I was just thinking that people will feel it and give you a different response.
yeah. The second agenda or the hidden agenda will sabotage the telling.
Okay. And I think it would be okay to, and this is where I love parts because it's okay. It takes away the shame, I'm guessing. I'm thinking for myself. I think it would take away the shame if I acknowledged, yeah, there's a part of me that wants to, let's say, make money off of this story. Like, I'm going to be on Oprah.
Right, exactly.
I remember like in the 90s, I was like, I'm going to be on Oprah. I guess you can still be on Oprah, but like that idea of like, okay, so if I acknowledge that there's a part of me that does have this agenda, then that actually would be a little bit easier to deal with
Yes.
that idea that there's a
Yes.
part of me that has this agenda.
Yes. And maybe it includes acknowledging it to the person you're telling, but sometimes it involves letting it go.
Yeah.
So that the only agenda, as it were, is to tell the story and feel connected.
Well, I hope this makes sense, but I think if I just acknowledge if I tell the story to myself that there's a part of me that has this agenda, I feel like that's all I would probably have to do is be like,
Yeah.
okay, just acknowledge it's a part of me has this agenda, make $1 zillion and be on Oprah. Okay. And then I think just by acknowledging it and giving voice to that part, then I can then come to you and tell you my story without that part
Yeah.
leading the bus, driving the
Yes,
bus.
right. That part can have a seat.
Yeah.
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 Yes, I love it. The fourth step is what I call working through punitive anger. And I say this as someone who has had punitive anger. I realized that there was a part of me that wanted to tell it, wanting the person who was part of it, who had sort of caused it or not helped me, to suffer. I'm not proud of that, but I'm just telling you that's the truth.
And as you're telling me that, I just want you to know I'm identifying that, like, yes, I have really similar parts, and I'm feeling that right now. Like, yeah, I get that.
Yes.
Similar parts,
Yes.
like, yes.
Yes. So punitive parts that just wanted the other person to suffer, that knew they deserved to suffer.
Yeah. Well, and they did. And
And
let's
it
go to
might
their
even be
house
good
and
for
egg
them
their
to
house.
suffer.
Yeah, my parts are going to join your parts, and we're going to go take our earrings off.
Nice. And the thing that has helped me with the 4-step was seeing the difference between damage and wound. So what I learned is at the heart of my punitive anger was a part of me that felt I had been damaged by what had happened to me,
Wow.
and that there was no fixing it. And there was so much rage about that I just wanted the other person to suffer. But and again, IFS therapy really helped me with this, as I understood, oh no, you're not damaged. You're wounded, and wounds can heal. That sort of punitive anger really, really dissipated. I didn't need to punish so much. I just needed to heal. So it was like, it was a huge moment. It happened at the IFS conference.
Wow.
Yeah, it was at a
And that
workshop, and it
is
was so powerful.
powerful. Oh my gosh, that is powerful.
Mm.
So that idea that I am not damaged, I have wounds and my wounds need to heal.
And they can heal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. It was really a huge turning point.
Mm.
And as I did that, so I did this is all before the telling of the story, right? Because if I was going to tell that story with I want you to suffer as you hear this, like, that person is not going to receive the story well.
Yeah.
They're not, nobody wants to be punished.
Right.
So yeah, the transformation inside me from damaged to wounded was such a relief and so hopeful, and it freed me. I'm so grateful. I'm unspeakably grateful to IFS because it's helped me so much with this process. I mean, all of what I'm sharing with you was really, came as a gift because of my work in IFS. So I'm so grateful to that. And part of that damage to woundness is clarity again, right? This quality of self is clarity.
Yeah.
So I thought I was damaged, but when I looked through the eyes of self, I discovered, no, I'm not damaged. Wounded.
Yeah. The other part of the thing that's coming up for me about damaged versus wounded is damaged, and then there is this there's this permanency, but there's also, I don't know why, but for some reason when I think of damaged, I do think of focused on the other person that damaged me. Where when I think of wounded, I think of then I need to heal, and I'm not actually even focused on the other person. I'm not sure why that
Yeah.
is, but
No,
I
it's so
feel it.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really brings it home. It brings it inside. It's less about them.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's a
Yeah.
relief. It's such a
Mm.
relief.
Yeah, that's the thing about this process that you're talking about is that so much healing and relief for you as the teller. Like this,
Mm.
even before you're telling the story, like, wow, there's so much transformation happening. And we're only on the 4th step. And I'm also thinking that, like, oh, this transformation's happening already.
Yes,
Mm,
right. Part of what's good about it is then the telling itself becomes less of like all the pressure has got to be on the telling to go well, because the
right.
process itself to be ready has been so healing and deep and profound.
Yeah.
Um, and time consuming. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. So it's not fast.
It's work, right? It's doing your work. Yeah.
It's doing your work.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's what you're saying is that I can attest to this too, is that doing my work in IFS has been well worth it.
Oh
The
God,
time,
yes.
the money, like
Oh
it's been
yes.
so well worth it doing the work.
I think it's probably the best investment I've
Mm,
ever made.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So shall I tell you number 5?
Yes.
Number 5, and sometimes this can be hard for the righteous parts of us. So this is why number 5 comes after number 4. But trauma or, bad stuff happening to us, whatever it is, does not usually bring out the best in us.
Mm,
And so step number 5 is we often need to start a conversation about something that's been very silenced by beginning with an acknowledgement of our own so-called bad behavior, taking
mm,
responsibility and apologizing for the way I've behaved that was born of the trauma. And
Wow.
I think that people, close family members, siblings, parents, all they know, the trauma's been silenced. So all they know is the way you've behaved. And they may be pissed off and irritated with you because you may not have behaved that well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we
Yes.
used to have this fantasy, like, oh, suffering is redemptive. No, I really don't think it is.
Wow.
Suffering does not, we have protectors. It generates protectors
Yeah.
who don't always behave well. So the fifth step is often the conversation opener is an acknowledgement of how I've behaved that has been hurtful.
Mm.
Yes. I mean, and to feel righteous,
Of cou-
self-righteousness is so seductive.
Yeah.
I have all kinds of self-righteous parts and
Yeah.
they can get energized, on a dime.
Yeah.
But self-righteousness will not be your friend in this conversation. If you want to be heard for the first time with an exiled part of you, self-righteousness pushes people away, but humility invites them in.
That is so interesting. It's almost like I'm reminded of like those protective parts of us that um, that draw what they're afraid of. Like self-righteous is
Mm,
actually so ugly, right? It's just such an ugly thing, even
yes.
though it demands
Yes.
to be beautiful. It is actually pretty ugly.
Exactly. That's one of the things I learned from Mike Elkin. Is like your protectors always draw to themselves the thing they most are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
So humbling. So humbling.
Yeah.
So yeah, so number 5 is, and am
Yeah.
I allowed to swear on your podcast or would you
Yes,
prefer
go
not?
ahead. No,
Is
swear
own your
ahead.
shit. Own your
Yeah.
shit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And it softens the whole thing. Everything kind of
Mm,
softens down like, okay, we're
mm.
being real now.
Yeah,
And
right.
you're being trustworthy.
Right, because you're being trustworthy to yourself, right? You're acknowledging these things that it's probably exhausting, right? The parts
Mm-hmm.
of you that have to be like, no, 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 I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. It's so exhausting. So it probably feels pretty good to be like, yeah, you're right. These are ways that parts of me have acted or things I've done that aren't so
Mm-hmm.
pretty.
Yes.
Mm.
Okay, so number 6
Okay.
is to practice with a trusted friend telling it to practice telling it to someone who's not a key player in the story. So
Okay.
often, when we're talking about a silent story, there's someone important that you want to hear this story.
Yeah.
Often
Yeah.
a parent or a sibling, but there are other parties to the story, and I would say don't tell it to them first.
Okay.
Practice telling it to someone else with a very specific goal in mind, to ask their help in helping you identify examples of where you were courageous.
Aw.
And usually we need help because it's a story where you've been in that dark closet. You don't have any perspective on your story.
Mm, mhm.
But so with my patients, often, if they have a silence narrative, I'll take my notepad and I'll draw a line down the middle. And on the left, I'll just write down the story. And on the right, every place I can think to put, I will write down a little example of where they were courageous.
Wow, I love
And
that.
then,
That's
because in
great.
their story, like they are blaming themselves so
Yeah.
badly, which is a huge part of the suffering, right? That's the burden.
Mm,
But I can say, but wait, in that moment, you did resist here. You did try to say something there. You did look at the
mm,
way you did that. That was you being courageous. And I'll try to list like multiple examples of their
mm,
courage. And that in itself is a profound experience.
mm,
Um, and it's so healing to transform a narrative from one of like shame to courage.
mm, mhm.
Um, and like, may I tell you a little? Can I tell you a little story about that?
Yeah,
So just
yeah.
this. So I had my IFS therapy yesterday, and an example comes to mind that could be useful here. So I had a lot of nightmares as a girl, and I was terrified, like mortally terrified that there was someone in the house who was going to kill me, and I would go out onto the landing. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor and my parents were on the 2nd floor. And I would go out onto the landing and like hug the banister and my little nightie and call for my mother, in this quavering voice, because I didn't want the bad guy to hear me.
Oh my
Because
gosh.
I thought he
Yeah.
was still in the house, but I wanted my mother to hear me. So I would stand out there and like, Mom, like so quiet and scared.
Oh.
And she would come up and, you know, to just acknowledge her. She had 6 children, and I had a lot of nightmares, so this happened a lot. She was being woken in the middle of the night frequently. So she wasn't like always super thrilled about it.
Yeah.
And, she wanted me to be a big girl. She wanted me to be independent. She wanted me to all of that. And so I got the message that I was sort of shamefully frightened, that there was something shameful about being
Oh.
so scared.
Yeah.
And just yesterday, so this is so fresh, we were like, wow, what would have happened if she could have said to you, Anne, I see your courage in standing out here in the pitch dark, afraid that the robber is going to come and hurt you, and having the courage to ask for help when you needed it. And it was like, whoa, that never occurred to me before.
No,
Oh
no.
my gosh,
I
imagine
know.
reframing it like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that I had the courage to ask for help.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't thinking that until yesterday. I was thinking like,
No, right.
oh, I was a scaredy cat girl.
Yeah, bad little girl. Instead of
Bad little
look at
fraidy cat,
you. Yeah, you're a courageous little thing. You're so cute and courageous. Like, oh my gosh.
Daring to call out into the dark night, standing
Right.
alone in this dark stairwell,
I know. Right.
asking
You
for
didn't
help when
hide
you
under
need it.
your covers. Like,
Yes. So it was like, oh,
wow.
wow. So it was very
Mm,
healing to me to
mm,
see her in a different way,
mm.
to see her courage, to have it be named. So then now that takes us to step 7, which is when you tell your story, to acknowledge the moments of your own courage when you tell it.
Mm.
And there's something about that that allows the listener to feel like they don't have to take care of you, and so they don't feel burdened.
Wow.
It's a strange thing, but I have found that it goes so much better if we tell silent stories, letting the hearer know that now when I think back to that, I see how brave I was. I see they feel let off the hook,
Mm,
and they just feel able to receive it. So
mm,
practice, but often we can't see that without help. So that's one of the ways the
mm,
therapist can be really useful, is to see the courage within the exile,
mm, mm.
which is, and if you think about an exile, like I love that Dick Schwartz called it an exile, because it's such appropriate. Like if you think about an exile in real terms, like someone who had to flee their country because of war or genocide or
Mm,
whatever it was. I mean, an exile is incredibly brave.
mm.
They had to get up and leave and go to a foreign place and live there, and then have the courage to try to come back and journey alone through the hot desert. It's like
I've never thought of an exile as being brave. I've never thought about that. Wow.
exiles have courage. I do a lot of work with
Wow.
asylum seekers
Mm,
who are among the bravest people I've ever met, and also the most traumatized.
mm,
You don't flee your whole country and your family and your language and your customs and your house unless you've suffered just overwhelming
mm.
trauma. And you're so brave to make the journey. So yes, our exiles have courage, but that's part of why step 6 is like, get a friend to help you see the courage.
Well, because when we think of trauma, we don't think of I had to be brave and courageous. I think of I'm scared and
Yes,
broken and damaged and
yes,
the
yes.
courage that it took to survive that.
So I want, if I may, just tell you that one of the shows that we're hoping will broadcast this October for Mental Illness Awareness Week is we are reframing. I'm always interested in how do we reduce the stigma of mental illness? And it was always like by showing the human side of it, by telling the story that fosters empathy. That's been my strategy until now. But now I have a new strategy, which is mental illness is a kind of courage boot camp. And that if we can reimagine someone with mental illness as someone who has had to develop so much courage to live with it. So say someone with PTSD who has frequent nightmares, who, who has to deal with mortal terror on a recurrent basis. That person has had to be really courageous. Someone with depression who has to summon up every last inch of energy just to get out of bed knows about digging deep and like pulling on your inner strength in a way that without depression you might never know that. Someone with anxiety, the same thing. Oh my gosh, be still your pounding heart and yet doing it anyway. You know, courage is doing what you need to do in the presence of fear.
Yeah.
So we're, and as one of my friends taught me, the feeling of courage is the feeling of fear. Like we get confused about it because we think courage is supposed to feel like triumphant, dun, da, da, da.
Right.
But no, the experience of the courageous person, even like the soldier on the battlefield or the exile coming home, is like major fear and still going ahead and doing it anyway.
So I just had this thought because you went da 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 da, like
Yeah.
you made like the Superman thing, and I thought
Mm-hmm.
I don't think of Superman as being courageous. He's just doing his thing. Like that's just who he is. That's
Mm,
like I'm not thinking of him being courageous.
mm.
But it's like right because that's but right if I'm feeling fearful and do it anyways, that's what we say about anxiety, right? That actually takes way more courage than
Yes.
Superman.
So I would say to you that people with anxiety and depression and PTSD are some of the most courageous people on the
Yeah.
planet.
Yeah.
And we
I'm gonna
don't
agree with you
see
on
it.
that.
We don't
Yeah.
recognize it, but
That's yeah.
it's absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
So we're going to have a show that really reframes mental illness in that light. I'm excited about it. Maybe there's something about telling the story to the person you wanted to tell it to, where you acknowledge your own courage. It keeps you unblended. You know, it keeps you from blending with the wounded part. So you're speaking for your exile. And when, as we know, like speaking for a part always goes better than speaking from it. When you speak from a part that is still ashamed or still angry or still feeling victimized, it will trigger parts in the listener. But if you speak for your exile, affirming the courage of your exile, it helps you stay unblended, but it helps the listener not blend with their own parts.
Mm.
It helps them stay really open to you, which is what you both want.
Mm.
So I've been practicing these steps myself. I've been sharing them with my patients, teaching about them, and maybe there's going to be an 8th step that I haven't come up with yet. It's always a work in process, but
Yeah.
it really profoundly helps our silenced, exiled stories be received like the prodigal son, be received
Mm.
and welcomed and
Mm.
feel seen in a way that we have longed for.
Mm. I think there needs to be an extra, like a part two of that story where the brother and the brothers get together and
Yes, right?
yeah, yeah,
Where the poor, well-meaning, the rule-following brother gets to feel validated too.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, you're so
Mhm.
right. Let's throw a party for you.
Yeah,
You're awesome.
yeah, yeah.
And of
Uh,
course, you have mixed feelings.
And he has a story too, right? He has a story. He has a
Mm-hmm.
story too, and burdens that he's been carrying.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It sounds like the
Mm-hmm.
importance, though, of the 6 steps. Like you can't just get to the 7th step. You need to do the work. Otherwise, you're going to be speaking. You're going to be speaking from the parts unless you do the work of
Mm-hmm.
the
Well,
first 6 steps.
yeah, you risk the repetition of traumatic silence. You really risk feeling shut down, shamed,
Yeah,
dismissed, minimized.
yeah.
And that's so excruciating.
Which has probably happened, right? Probably happened over and over and over, which is partly why you end up stuck in the closet for so long, because that
Mm-hmm.
probably has happened where you've
Yes.
tried to tell someone a little bit, or there's,
Well, that's part of what we say about trauma, right? The nature of trauma is it repeats. And I think that silence like this is, I call it traumatic silence, and
yeah,
it also repeats,
yeah.
which
I
is the
think
whole
you,
reason we need these steps is to try to undo the repetition.
yeah, you had said, I think when you and I talked about the wounding of silence, and I loved that. I thought, yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, it's so lonely.
Yeah. And I thought of our parts, that happens with our parts, that we don't listen to them, and our parts are often alone, right? Like our exiles are alone and silent, and often they just feel so much better when we hear them.
Or when we go toward them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always ask at the end, if you weren't doing all the stuff that you're doing, what would you do instead of? You get to do anything in the world you wanted to. What would you do instead of?
Hmm. Anything I could do instead of doing safe space radio, or instead of being a clinician?
All that. Yeah, but yeah, instead of doing all those like very adult things that you're doing.
Instead of pulling up all the invasive raspberry plants in my garden?
Yes.
Oh yeah, there's definitely something I would do instead of that.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think I would work less probably.
Mm,
Um,
take
there's
more
not a
walks with
lot
your
of
dog.
money in public radio. So I don't mean I would work less at safe space radio. I mean, I think I would probably, I've begun already to do it. I've stopped seeing all my medication only patients. Psychopharm only, I just feel like that's really not where the healing and recovery is. So I've begun doing, I've been closing that part of my shop,
Mm,
because I just don't, it's not where my heart is. And
mm,
I think I would have, I would do what COVID-19 has been sort of already set in motion, which is just having more time to listen inside.
mm.
I just re-listened to an interview I did with Jamie Pennebaker. I don't know if you know his work. Tammy, you might be so interested. He, I don't know, I could probably, I know we've already spent a long time, so I don't know. I'll try to tell it super quick. He did this study looking at people writing for 15 minutes a day for 4 days in a row about the worst experience of their life. And then the control group wrote about their shoes or their outfit or something, but they wrote for 15 minutes a day. And the people who poured out their worst experiences and their feelings a year later had fewer emergency room visits, fewer complicated medical problems, less drinking, less like every possible bad thing was better. Even they even started doing some cellular studies looking at wound healing was better. I mean, it was just like radically good for your health to tell your exiled stories. even if even if you can't afford IFS therapy, the blank page can be like self energy. The
Yeah.
blank page is receptive and open to your story,
Yeah.
and you can write it.
Yeah.
And so I've been writing in my
Mm,
journal, and it is been so healing for me. I've been listening to
mm.
myself much better when I'm
Yeah.
not rushing around. So I
Yeah.
think I would be writing more
I
and
love
being
that.
quiet alone more.
Mm, I love that. I love writing in my journal too. And one of the things that I think I've made up, because I don't know that I got this from somewhere, but I write a P with a circle on it. And then as if that's I'm writing from a part, like a part is saying, all right, P. And I feel like that gives me permission to
Mm-hmm.
say ridiculous things, right?
I
Because
do the
it's a
exact
part
same
of
thing.
me.
I do the exact same thing. A
You
P with
do?
a circle around it. Yes.
We must have got it for somewhere. Okay. Because I'm like, there's high five. Yeah.
I know.
And then it's sort of, and then I let da, 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 and then I'll put an S for self. And
Yeah.
then, often it's just, I hear you. What else do you want to say? I'm here with you. And it's
Right.
amazing.
Me too. The IFS journaling is such a wonderful process. It's a way to tell your silent story.
Yeah. Mm,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. And I feel like for me, like, even if it's telling the story of like, I'm pissed off today because of blah, 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 that I would never say, and that parts of me would push down, would repress. I'm not allowed to be angry. So, because I'm a good girl. So
Mm-hmm.
even if it's even if it's that like small story of just this feeling that I'm having today about
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and that even is a story.
I have one more story I'd love to tell you, but this is not so much. We did this series on the radio about refugees and asylum seekers, and I interviewed one woman from Burundi, Alice is her name, and she talked about how when she went to meet with the asylum officer, she didn't tell him that she'd been raped because in her culture, you didn't talk about those things. I mean, that was just so shameful. And also, he was like a male authority figure, and she was alone, and she was scared, and she had been raped by the government officials in her country. So he was a government official, so she just didn't feel safe. So she didn't tell him. And she was not given a pro bono lawyer because her case wasn't considered strong enough, because she hadn't known how to tell this exiled story. And so she eventually got into therapy, and that helped her, and her therapist helped her write out the story, and she went back, and she ultimately got her asylum. That was years ago, but she got it. She's here. So she told this story on the radio, and it was like, oh my gosh. And this was before I understood that essentially, I asked her a question. I said, well, what percentage of asylum seekers have been raped? She was really quiet. And then she said, I would say all. And I just burst into tears. It was live radio. I was like, oh, I had no idea. And I was just overwhelmed. I was devastated. And so then I was like, well, okay. So the thing that helped you get your asylum was having a therapist help you tell your silent story. So I was like, what if I called all my friends that are therapists, and we tried to create something to help asylum seekers tell their story first to a compassionate listener before you have to go to a government official.
Yeah.
So together, live on the radio, we formed this group called the Hearing Aids. And so we were 12 people. We were 6 asylums. No, I can't remember if it was 6. I think it was, I'm not going to have the numbers right. But anyway, this was a few years ago. We started meeting a group of asylum seekers who had gotten their asylum, all of whom had survived sexual assault, and who served as the kind of cultural brokers and the interpreters, and this group of 6 volunteer therapists. And we started meeting with asylum seekers to hear their silent stories and to kind of go through some of these steps to help them release their shame, to help them see their courage. And we would write it down in English for them to help them go to their lawyer to get their asylum. And it was such a profound way for me to really use what I was learning from IFS therapy to make a difference. It was just so profoundly moving to me. And then, unfortunately, tragically, when the Trump administration came into power, all of a sudden, no one was being granted asylum. And they were ending up having to flee the country. And we ended up having to stop doing it. And it was devastating. It was devastating. So I hope, that our political culture can change, and that we can become receptive to the stories and the living beings of asylum seekers who have silenced stories, who are literally exiled. Literally. So this is very real, what we're talking about.
They're the most courageous
Yes.
women.
Yes. Wow. So I just want to give a shout out to Elise, who was the inspiration for that work. And she's one of the most courageous women I've ever met.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah.
And there's just a part of me that believes that you'll be able to do that work again. Really soon.
I hope to. I hope to. Yeah. And, wherever you are listening, if you have any therapeutic skill, or just if you have a warm heart and a good listening ability, we can all be doing this. Yeah. This is work we can be doing to help each other.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. You don't have to be a trained therapist.
No.
No. You just have to be trustworthy and kind.
Yeah. And to do your own work, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Anne, this was great. Thank you so much.
I have loved talking to you. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
And I'm completely supporting your podcast. I think it's fabulous you're doing this.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you like this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFSTammy and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time. Today's episode was sponsored by Brighter Vision. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen way too often. A nice-looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice-looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off exclusively for listeners of the One Inside podcast. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/inside. Again, that's brightervision.com/inside.